All right, we're going to look at the last of the trees. There's a couple more trees in the Bible, but we're just not going to look at them. We're going to look at this view from a tree. Then we're going to start view from a mountain next week. We're going to look at two or three of the mountain, what some stories around that are centered around mountains. You can guess probably the first one. We'll hit Mount Sinai. We'll miss Mount Ararat because we don't know where the Noah's Ark is, but it's probably somewhere in Turkey. We're not sure about that. So anyway, be opening your Bibles to Matthew 21. We're actually going to look at two different texts because there's something in the two different texts that I want to look at. It's the same story. To give you a fix chronologically, it's Monday of the last week of the life of Christ. Jesus has made on Sunday his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. Remember the palms, all of that event. It is the last week. Jesus will be crucified. Friday morning is really the time, but the trials now start Thursday night and go into Friday. And so Jesus is soon to be crucified, and he knows this. I mean, he set his face to go back to Jerusalem. One of the things that maybe you've picked up on in your studies is that last week, while Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem and did go to Jerusalem, Jesus stayed just a few miles, a couple of miles actually, outside of Jerusalem. He stayed at Bethany. And each day that we have recorded of that last week, Jesus would make a journey from Bethany, just like say, just a couple of miles out, into Jerusalem. And it is on Monday that he's already granted, he went into Jerusalem, and Sunday, on Monday, he is in Bethany. He is going to make his way to Jerusalem. And there's something that happens, and it's one of those things that when we look at it, we ask ourselves, would Jesus really do this? The skeptics have said this is one of those events that they doubt that Jesus did. But it is interesting, and it is kind of eye-opening to think that Jesus would do this with regards to a tree, that he would curse a tree. This is, as we see it from a standpoint of a miracle, this is the only miracle that we have recorded where there's a negative outcome with regards to the actions of Jesus. And it's a negative outcome, at least for the tree, but it is a story nevertheless. So let's look at these two stories. Let's look at them and see what happens. Matthew 21 is where we want to start. We want to look at Matthew's account. Matthew changes the order a little bit of what Luke does. And the reason being because you have to understand Matthew's approach versus Luke's approach. If you ever really want to study the life of Jesus chronologically, but you say, I just want to study it out of one book of the Bible, go to the book of Luke. Luke tends to go more chronologically with regards to how he recorded the gospel, the life of Christ. Matthew's account of the gospel, Matthew tends to group things together. He tends to put things together. And if you go through Matthew, one of the things you find out is that Matthew has about 5 different sermons of Jesus. And we could pick apart all of them, but let's just take, for instance, if you compare, say, Matthew with Luke, you'll notice that, say, the Beatitudes are all there at Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. And yet, if you go to Luke, they're spread throughout Luke. And so some have said that Jesus really didn't preach the Sermon on the Mount. Well, probably did. And the difference there being the fact that Any good sermon is worth repeating some other time, or any good thought is worth repeating sometime else. And so Jesus probably said the Beatitudes, if you will, more than once in his teaching. And so Luke would be correct in where he puts them, but he spread them out. Did he ever preach the Sermon on the Mount? I think so. And we could go through and look at other things that Matthew has grouped together and compare it, say, with Luke. So if you want a chronological study, study Luke. If you want more of a thematic study, study Matthew. If you're just looking for one book of the Bible that you want to study for a while, and that helps. But Matthew talks about, beginning in chapter 21, verse 18, in the morning, as he returned to the city, this is talking about Jesus, he was hungry. And seeing a fig tree by the road, he came to it and found nothing on it but leaves, and said to it, let no fruit grow on ever again. Immediately the fig tree withered away. Then the disciples saw it. They marveled, saying, how did the fig tree wither away so soon? So Jesus answered and said to them, assuredly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what was done to the fig tree, but also if you say to this mountain, be removed and be cast in the sea, it'll be done. And whatever things you ask in prayer, believing, you will receive. There's a lot there, and I want to talk about a lot of it, but let's go on and read Mark's account, I'm talking about Luke, but actually this event's in Mark. There is a mention of it in Luke, but it doesn't add anything. But I want us to note Mark's account. Mark chapter 11. Mark chapter 11. In Mark chapter 11, beginning in verse 12, it says, now the next day, when they had come out from Bethany, he was hungry, and seeing from afar a fig tree having leaves, he went to see if perhaps he would find something on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. In response, Jesus said to it, let no one eat fruit from you ever again. And his disciples heard it. Now jump on down to verse 20 of the same chapter. And in the morning, this would be Tuesday morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree dried up from the roots. And Peter, remembering, said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered away. So Jesus answered and said to him, have faith in God. For assuredly I say to you that whoever says to this mountain, be removed and be cast in the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that those things he says will be done, he will have whatever he says. Therefore I say to you, whatever things you ask, when you pray, believe that you receive them, and you will have them. There's not a lot of difference. Why I wanted to read Mark's account, though, was something that we'll highlight in just a second. Notice the text says Jesus was hungry. Makes sense, doesn't it? It's morning of the next day. They're making their way from Bethany to Jerusalem. He is hungry. And notice in Mark's account that it says that the tree had leaves. Now this was important, and it was important with regards to the account here, because fig trees in that area have what amounts to little buds that are still, even to this day, they're harvested and sold in the marketplace, especially in the springtime, especially around March, April. And so a fig tree, seeing a fig tree, Jesus seeing a fig tree and understanding that's a fig tree, goes to it expecting the buds to be there that he could eat. Now, notice in Mark's account, it says, but it wasn't the season for figs. So that throws us off. But the thought is, is that it is springtime. It is what we would say March or April of our time. That those little buds would have been there or should have been there and he could have eaten. But when Mark says that it was not the season for figs, we believe what Mark is trying to say is that it was not late summer. Late summer is when the full-blown figs, full grown, after the buds have come on out, produced fruit, it's full grown, it's matured, it's harvested more like July or August. And so it's believed that that's at least the acceptable answer for seemingly a quandary there. Why would Jesus go and look at a tree expecting something and not find it and thus curse the tree? That's probably the answer to that. But then when we look at the story, and if you don't mind, I want to go back to Matthew's account. That's why I wanted to look at Luke's account, but I'm going to go back to Matthew's account to kind of just stay there. When Jesus says, "Let no fruit grow on you ever again," Matthew says immediately the fig tree withered away. Luke's account says that it was the next day. Does that create a problem? Not really. For some skeptics, it does. It could be that the tree began to wither immediately. Probably so. All of the miracles of Jesus, there is an immediacy. And Jesus, when Jesus healed the blind man, he could see. When Jesus healed the lame man, he picked him up and remember immediately that he was able to walk. And so there was probably a good withering, but there was probably a good pronouncement of dead, if you will, according to Mark's account, on Tuesday. And so that's probably the synthesizing of the two stories. But then the explanation is kind of somewhat hard for us to understand and hard for us to figure out. Because basically, if you look in verse 21 and 22, Jesus said, you can pray for anything, as long as you have enough faith, it'll happen. But then we say, well, wait a minute, we pray. And we've also know of great individuals that have prayed, but they never moved mountains. Well, probably what's happening here is Jesus is using a figure of speech. And depending upon who you want to look at with regards to what figure of speech it is, some say it's a metaphor, some say that it is an analogy, some say that it is hyperbole. But really what Jesus is saying is don't doubt the power of God. Have confidence in your prayers, belief and trust in God that as long as you are an individual that you're supposed to be, because remember, God hears prayers of the righteous, and you ask in accordance to his will, 1 John chapter 5, that God will answer your prayer. And that's really the assurance, and that's the confidence that we have, that we can ask, and we can ask what we will, and God will grant that, as long as it is in accordance, of course, with his will. The parable, or not parable, but the story, the miracle of the fig tree, is a miracle that has really, because of what it's trying to say, been a great teacher for a lot of folks. Now, what do we learn? Does anybody? Let's go before we get into that. Does anybody have anything to say about the event? What happened? It's a short story. I will say this with regards to Mark. If you're reading Mark's account of the gospel is really full of the miracles of Jesus. I mean, it's interesting. Let me just back up for just a minute. Matthew's account, Matthew tends to group things. Mark centers his thoughts, just about all of his thoughts, around a miracle of Jesus. Luke's account is very chronological. It is, from a page number wise, it is the longest of the gospel accounts. John's account of the gospel is different in that it is for the purpose of producing faith. John centers around 7 miracles, whereas Mark centers around a whole lot of different ones. John centers around 7 miracles, but his whole purpose is not to talk about the miracles. Mark's was. John's account is produce faith. And so he gives what I call the autobiography of Jesus. Remember the 7 I ams, I'm the way, the truth, and life, and all the different 7 I ams, they're found in the book of John. John goes at it a little differently. And all of this is done differently for 2-3 different reasons. First of all, because of the writer himself. Second of all, because to whom he is writing. Thirdly, because of the purpose which he hopes to accomplish in his writings. And I think that's why God did all of that. Nevertheless. All right. Anything else before we get into some lessons to learn about the fig tree? Well, let's think about what we can learn. One of the great lessons to learn, I think, from the fig tree is that we've all got to be fruit bearers, fruit producers. Look with me in Luke chapter 13. We're going to bounce around now. Luke chapter 13. I want to begin in verse 6 of Luke 13. We find a parable of Jesus. One of the things that most theologians, not all, but because you can't get theologians to agree on anything. They can't even agree on what day of the week it is a lot of times. But a great many of theologians will say, well, when you look at the parable or the story of the withering fig tree, that story that we just read, a lot of them will say, well, that's Israel. And Israel was claiming to be religious, but they weren't really doing anything about it. They had rejected Jesus. They had rejected his teachings. But yet they said, we are the religious people of the day. Remember the Pharisees. That was their big claim. We're God's people. We can trace our lineage. We can go back to Abraham. But we are practicing the law. But they had done nothing with regards to Jesus except to reject him and ultimately to crucify him. And so when we get to the story that we just read of the fig tree, there's a reminder that Israel, you're not doing what you say. You are professing one thing, but your performance is completely different. It reminds us then of the importance of simply not being a Christian, not saying we're a Christian, but living the Christian life. Look in Luke 13. Let's begin in verse 6, if you don't mind. Jesus spoke a parable. And he says, a certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it and found none. Then he said to the keeper of his vineyard, look, for 3 years I have come asking fruit on this fig tree and find none. Cut it down. Why does it use up the ground? But he answered and said to him, sir, let it alone this year also until I dig around it and fertilize it. And if it bears fruit, well. But if not, after that, you can cut it down. Jesus is speaking this parable about this man who owns this fig tree and then this man who is the gardener tending to the fig tree. And the whole principle of the parable, the whole principle of the lesson is that you got to produce fruit. Jesus tells the story. This man wants to cut down fruit, and the man says, "Oh, let's work with it a little bit longer. Let's tend to it a little bit longer." I read a story years ago. Don't know the truth of it, but the application is really good. Of a man that had gone several years, had an apple tree, and he'd gone several years and it wasn't producing any apples, and he took rusty nails and he drove those rusty nails into the tree in order to wake up the tree. And sure enough, the next year he had apples. Now, I'm not saying that that's a valid story. I've never heard of that since then. But the application is interesting. Sometimes we have to be awakened, don't we, to the fact that we are where we are. We get in ruts and we get comfortable, and we're not producing the fruit that we need to produce. Look, since you're in look now in John 15. You probably figured that's where I was going, and that's where I'm headed. John 15. We want to look at the first several verses of John 15. We'll probably look at the first 8 verses. That kind of completes the thought. Jesus said, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. You are already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit, for without me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he's cast out as a branch and is withered. And they gather them and throw them into the fire, and they're burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, you will ask what you desire, and it shall be done for you. By this, my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, so you will be my disciples. We understand this. I don't think we have studied it together, but you probably studied it at various times with other individuals. Jesus is the vine and we're the branches. And Jesus basically says, hey, you can't just be a vine. You got to be a fruit producing vine. You got to do what you're supposed to do. And that's the principle. That's the principle of fruit, bearing fruit. Do what you're supposed to do. Do what you can do. We can only do what our talents and our physical bodies will allow us to do. But at the same time, too, we're to do those things that we can't do. I've shared with you the story that the preacher shared with me a few years back about he was talking, I think he may have been talking about fruit bearing. I don't know exactly what he was talking about. But anyway, he had a sweet little lady that was a shut-in that called him up and said, I can't do anything, but I can pray. She said, but I can't do anything in the church, but I want to do what the Lord wants me to do. And he says, I'll have you a list every Monday of people you can pray for. And so every Monday he either phoned her or got the secretary to phone her or somehow got her a list of people that she could spend all week praying for those individuals. That was the only thing she said she could do, which was probably right. But she wanted to bear fruit. Jesus says, abide in me. There's where you get the source of what you need. Jesus is the vine. You've got to abide in him. We're the branch. We have to abide in him. You cut a branch off, it dies, right? Why? It has no source of nutrients. It has no source of what it needs to survive. Jesus reminds us then that we got to abide in him. Go back to then the story of the withered fig tree. Why did Jesus curse it? Because it wasn't producing what it was supposed to do. It wasn't doing it. Wasn't what it was supposed to do. It was, if you will, a pretender instead of what it was supposed to be. A second lesson is that we can learn to trust in God. The idea of having little faith, it's important. But the idea of trusting in God is as Jesus applies then and continues to teach about prayer and praying. And if you have faith, you can move mountains. Well, we need to understand that there were times in which individuals and groups were, what's the good word? chastise would not, I guess would be a good word, but it's not the word I'm looking for. But anyway, they were told or reprimanded. There's the word I'm looking for. They were reprimanded for their little faith. If you go back in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew the 6th chapter, Jesus talks about those that were worrying. And what were they worrying about? Provisions. What they were going to eat, what they were going to drink. And they were worried about it. And Jesus is trying to teach them, don't worry about it. God's going to take care of you. But he rebukes them as being individuals, oh, ye of little faith. Well, there's Matthew chapter 18. Jesus rebukes those who are doubting the protection of God. And he calls those individuals little faith. They were reprimanded for having little faith. There were also those in Matthew 17 that were having problems with power of God. And once again, Jesus rebukes them as being individuals of little faith. I think, at least for me, when I pull out this idea, preacher, can I really move mountains? I remember somebody as a kid, I remember hearing them say that the reason we can't move mountains today is because we don't have enough faith. I personally don't think that's what these verses are exactly teaching. I think what they're saying is you got to have faith, carry it to God, trust in God, and have faith, and God will hear and God will answer. Because think about it. If we say every time you pray to move a mountain, if you have faith, that mountain will move, means that God can never tell you no. Or never tell you wait. Or never tell you, I'm going to give you something else. So see, the individual that whoever said that in my past, I think needs to think about some other things. Have faith, trust God, leave it at his doorstep, let him take care of it, let him do what he will, and whatever he wills will be best for us. One more, and then if anybody has anything, we'll let you talk. I think another lesson to learn is to live authentically. This was the big discussion among young people back 10, 11, 12 years ago, is who's authentic. Who's authentic? And this was about the time my son was in college. And this is where I learned this, is that the young people at that time were talking about, there's a lot of Christians that are hypocrites, a lot of Christians not doing what they're supposed to do. That's always been true. But the big thing, Suzanne and I, we were on vacation or something, and we went down to Freed-Hardeman in the middle of the week, and I think had supper with Ethan, and I know we stayed for church at Henderson, and the individual preaching was a student, and he talked about living authentically. Well, I think in many ways these verses apply to that our actions must reflect the heart of God, that we must live authentically. We must practice what we profess. Let's look at at least one verse, a little couple. How about Galatians chapter 1? Galatians chapter 1. Paul writes remember we've talked about this before. Galatians was written to a province, to an area, but there were several churches, and so we talk about the churches, plural, of Galatia. In Galatians chapter 1 and verse 10, Paul, in talking about life and how it should be lived and how it should be not just professed but formed, he says, do I now persuade men or God? Do I seek to please men? Or if I still pleased men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. In some ways, there's the last part of that verse, he's saying, Jesus is not the popular thing to do. And so I have to ask myself in my life, who am I pleasing? Who am I pleasing? I sat down back years ago with the elders. I always sit down with elders and talk to them, but we were sitting in a meeting and we were discussing a particular family. And as we were talking about them, I said, I'm sad to say that I don't have much faith in the children, grown adult children. And the elders agreed with me. And I said, I'm afraid that when their mother passes away, that will be the end of them coming to church. They agreed with me. Sadly, I guess could be say that we were prophetic, because when the mother passed away, sure enough, by 6 months later, they were all through. I couldn't get them to church to save my life. And you ask, okay, were you just coming to church? Or were you really faithful in your duties while you were attending church? Now, I leave that between them and God. But you have to wonder if they were really authentic in their faith. If they were doing what they were doing because that's what they realized they needed to do in order to please God, or if they were just pleasing their mom. Like I say, I leave that in the hands of God. But I understand wherein my responsibility lies. Look, since we're in Galatians, let's look at 2 Corinthians. We're right close. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. I want to look at verse 21, but let's go all the way back. Let's go back to verse 16, just because the sentence is so long. Thanks be to God who puts the same earnest care for you into the heart of Titus. For he not only accepted the exhortation, but being more diligent, he went to you of his own accord. Now this is important. Maybe we've jumped into a little something that I'll just remind you of. Titus here is the same one that Paul wrote, the book of Titus to. Titus was very important in Paul's ministry, but was not mentioned a lot. Titus was the one that Paul used to take the collection for the poor saints to Jerusalem. Remember in 1 Corinthians 16, he talks about taking up the collection that lay by him and store up on the first day of the week. And when we talk about 1 Corinthians 16, we talk about the connection there was that they were taking up collection for the poor saints of Jerusalem. How did he get there from Corinth? Titus was the one that Paul used to get the money and to carry it there. So that helps you maybe understand where we are with regards to this. Verse 18. And he sent with him the brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches. And not only that, but who was also chosen by the churches to travel with us with this gift, which is administered by us to the glory of the Lord himself, and show your mind ready. Avoiding this, now this is where really I want to start, that anyone should blame us in this lavish gift which was administered by us, providing honorable things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. We've sent with them our brother, whom we've often proved diligent in many things, but now much more diligent because of the great confidence that we have in you. What I want you to see is that verse 21, providing honorable things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. That Paul is saying Titus was a man that was of great character. He was authentic in his faith. He provided honorable things, not just in the sight of the Lord, but in the sight of all men. So you practice what you preach. We could talk a lot about that. Anything else? Do you remember in John 1 and verse 47 what's said about Nathanael with regards to an authentic faith? John 1, verse 47. Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said to him, Behold, an Israelite, indeed, in whom is no deceit. That was a recommendation out of this world. An Israelite in whom there's no deception. He's authentic. Well, we got a couple of other ideas we maybe just mention. Also, the story of the fig tree and the withering of the fig tree helps us to understand that there is really a form of godliness. Paul talked to Timothy about it in 2 Timothy chapter 3. Let me just right quick read you a verse. That there were those, he talks about, latter days, times, folks being not what they're supposed to be. And he says there in verse 5, there were those having a form of godliness, but denying its power. And from such people, he says, turn away. Well, he's listed a whole bunch of other things, but those who have a form of godliness. And we're going to use broad terms for just a second, in the religious world, so that encompasses not just those that have like faith like us, but in the religious world, we understand that there are a lot of folks that say, this is what I believe, this is what I practice. They have a form of godliness, but it's not the form of godliness that they need to have. They have a mold. The word form there is the idea of a mold, but it's an incorrect mold. We need to look at a life that is lived for God. Someone explained it this way. They said, they look spiritual. Their language, their rituals, their morals, the things that they participated in did not always conform with what they professed. They were close to God, but here's the key. They weren't changed by God. And the story of the withered fig tree and then the idea of the subsequent prayer is the fact that you can't just say that you're something, but you got to be it. And then here's another one that we'll throw in. It's kind of a strange one, but a good lesson to learn is that you need to always be ready. Fig tree, where's fig tree? You say, well, fig tree is fig tree. And why was it barren? Why did it not have any figs? Don't know. Every once in a while, things won't do what they're supposed to do, right? Suzanne and I have a Christmas cactus. And our Christmas cactus is really different, probably from yours. It blooms not on Christmas, but when it wants to bloom. And this year, it said, I'm not blooming. Now, I don't know why. I know I'm going to repot it and change it a little bit and see if I can't convince it that it needs to act right, or it can go out in the yard and let the lawnmower eat it. But you see, it needs to do what it's supposed to do. As Christians, we too, because we don't know. Why did fig tree? I don't know. It just didn't. And from it should have been ready for whatever happened to it. And we need to be ready as well for the coming of the Lord. Anything else?
Interesting, the disciples in this one. They've been with him for 3 years. They've watched him heal the sick, raise the dead, make the blind see, and he killed the fig tree, and they're amazed by it.
Yeah.
One of those duh moments.
I think the apostles were really good. Don't get me wrong. But there was so much duh about them. I mean, they never, to me, they never understood. Jesus kept telling them he was going to die. Kept telling them, and they just never seemed to get it. They never seemed to understand the resurrection.
Well, it's an encouragement to me because here was men who walked with him every day. And they didn't understand it, and they didn't get it, and they had a hard time with their faith. So, every now and then, we all struggle with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We all do. And I think that's a great lesson to pull from this is we all have faith. We got to make sure that our faith's what it's supposed to be. But perfect faith, we're not going to have. I think I ran across a thought the other day, and it goes with this. It's not the same thing, but it goes with it. It was discussing the idea of why. We always ask the question why. And sometimes we don't get the answer that we want. And this author made the statement, and I think they're correct, that we cannot have and do not, as individuals, have perfect knowledge. We never will. And so God gives us what we need, but not everything. Deuteronomy 29:29. The author did not use Deuteronomy 29:29, but I think it applied. So we take what we have and what we understand with regards to our faith, and we push on, knowing that we do struggle. Yeah. Yeah, I love the Bible because of the perfect imperfection that's there. It's perfect, Bible's perfect, but the imperfection of all the people. You look, I was going to talk about, if I had time, I was going to talk about Daniel and Esther, and yet they had struggles, but they were good folks. Anything else? Well, let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day, thankful for the blessing of it, thankful that you have watched over us to this point, and we ask that you continue to watch over us and bless us. We're mindful of all those that are sick, and we ask that you be with them and bless them. We also ask that you be with Chester's grandson as he's deployed, that he'll have safety and he'll be able to come back home before too long. We ask that you be with Teresa tomorrow and her family and Eddie's memorial service. We also ask that you be with Doris and Vic and their family and the loss of Walter, that you bless them tomorrow. Will be a tough day for both families. We ask that you watch over them and keep them. We ask that you watch over us and bless us. May we ever be the example that we need to be. May we ever live the life that we're supposed to live. May we ever draw closer to you each day. Watch over us, bless us, keep us, hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Thank y'all. Y'all have a great week.